She didn't have to stop. That's the thing nobody talks about. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Snow was coming down hard. Meredith Callahan had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital. Her feet ached. Her back was screaming. At home, cold pasta was waiting, and her phone was packed with texts she'd been ignoring for days. She had every reason to walk past the old woman sitting alone on the bench outside the subway station. She stopped anyway, because that's who Meredith was. Not a hero. Just a woman who couldn't walk past suffering without doing something about it. The woman was covered in snow, silver hair plastered to her forehead, sitting perfectly still, as if the cold wasn't even real, as if her mind had wandered somewhere else entirely. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman turned, her eyes distant, searching Meredith's face for something familiar. "She forgot to come," she whispered. "She always comes. She never forgets." A silence as fragile as thin ice. "She forgot tonight." Meredith didn't argue. She spotted the medical bracelet on the woman's wrist, an emergency number engraved on the metal, and she dialed it. A man answered, his voice low, controlled, cold. "Which station?" Meredith told him. "Don't let her move." The line went dead. 11 minutes later, 3 black SUVs cut through the snow. 6 men in dark coats stepped out first, scanning, silent, moving like soldiers. Then the back door of the middle car opened. Keenan Ashford, tall, sharp-jawed, dressed in black as if the cold was something that happened to other people. He moved toward the bench as if nothing in the world could slow him down. His eyes found his mother, and something cracked across his face, just for a second, and then it was gone. "Mom, let's go." But Margaret Ashford didn't reach for her son. She reached for Meredith. Her grip closed around Meredith's wrist, tight, certain, and she looked at Meredith with complete recognition. "Catherine," she breathed. "You came. I knew you'd come. You always keep your promises." The world stopped. A guard leaned toward Keenan and whispered, "Catherine, her daughter, passed away 5 years ago." Keenan went still. Then he looked at Meredith. Really looked. Past the scrubs, past the exhaustion, past the stranger who had no business being here. He looked at her face. Meredith didn't know who Catherine was. She didn't know what those black SUVs meant. She didn't know why 6 armed men had just surrounded a subway station at 2 o'clock in the morning. But she knew how to read a room. She'd survived enough to learn that. And this room was telling her one thing clearly. Something had just shifted, and she was standing right in the center of it. If something in your chest already feels tight, drop a comment. This story hasn't even started yet. Like, share, and subscribe. What happens next will stay with you. Keenan Ashford stood there, watching his mother's hand clamp tight around a stranger's wrist, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know what to do. He'd built an entire empire on always knowing what the next step was. He'd controlled negotiations worth millions of dollars. He'd faced enemies who wanted him dead without blinking. But now, standing in the snow at 2 o'clock in the morning, watching his mother call a stranger by the name of someone who was gone, he was completely powerless. Jonas stepped closer, his voice low. "Sir, we should get her home." Keenan nodded, but he didn't take his eyes off the 2 women in front of him. He moved in, careful, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. "Mom," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Let's go home. It's so cold." Margaret didn't look at her son. She kept looking at Meredith, a trembling smile on her lips. "Catherine, come with Mom. Mom will make soup for you, the kind you like." Meredith felt her chest tighten. She didn't know who Catherine was. She didn't know how this woman had lost her child. But she recognized grief. She'd seen it too many times in the hospital. Mothers calling their children's names through delirium. Husbands holding the hand of a wife who'd already gone cold and refusing to let go. Grief didn't need language to be understood. Keenan looked at Meredith, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes. Not the coldness from before, not the control. It was a plea. He didn't say it out loud, but she read it anyway. "Help me." He drew in a deep breath, and the next word left his mouth as if it had its own weight. "Please." Just one word. But the way he said it, like it was a language he wasn't used to speaking, like it hurt him to let it out. Meredith understood right away that this man wasn't accustomed to asking anyone for anything. She glanced down at Margaret's hand, still wrapped around her wrist. The woman tightened her grip, as if afraid Meredith would disappear. Meredith looked back at Keenan. "Only until she calms down," Meredith said. "Then I'll go." Keenan nodded once, decisive, as if they'd just signed a contract. Jonas opened the door of the middle car, and Meredith helped Margaret to her feet. The old woman trembled, but she walked steadily with Meredith beside her. Inside the vehicle, warmth rushed over them like an embrace. Margaret sat close to Meredith, still refusing to let go of her hand. Keenan took the front seat beside the driver, and the convoy began to move. "Catherine," Margaret said, her voice like someone telling a fairy tale. "Do you remember the garden? Mom's rose garden?" Meredith didn't know how to answer, but Margaret didn't need an answer. She kept talking, her eyes on the window, though in truth she was looking into somewhere much farther away. "You used to run between the rose bushes when you were little. I scolded you all the time because the thorns would scratch you, but you never listened. You said if something was beautiful, you had to touch it." She gave a soft laugh, the laugh of someone living inside a memory. "I'll make soup for you. Chicken soup with dill. You loved it. Every time you were sick, I made it." Meredith sat still and listened. She didn't try to correct her. She didn't try to drag her back into the present. She simply stayed there. Let herself be held by that hand. Let the woman talk. Sometimes that was all someone needed. By accident, Meredith lifted her gaze to the rearview mirror and caught Keenan looking back. Not at her, at his mother. And the expression on his face in that instant stole her breath. No coldness. No control. Only pure pain. The kind of pain a child carries when they're losing their mother day by day, piece by piece, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. He thought no one could see, but Meredith saw. Then he realized she was watching through the mirror, and the mask slid back into place at once, so fast she almost believed she'd imagined what she'd just seen. Almost. She turned away, stared out the window at snow whitening the city. She reminded herself, "Help, then leave. Don't get involved." She'd made that mistake once already. Thinking she could save someone. Thinking her kindness would be repaid. And what she'd gotten in return was 3 years of bruises. 3 years of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. 3 years of believing it was love. No, she wouldn't do it again. She'd help this old woman settle, and then she'd go. She'd return to her small apartment, eat the cold noodles, and keep living her ordinary life. She didn't belong in a world of black SUVs and men who moved like soldiers. She didn't belong here. Margaret squeezed her hand tighter and whispered, "I'm so glad you came home, Catherine." Meredith didn't answer. She just watched the snow and wondered what she was doing. She didn't know that a single okay would pull her into a world she didn't belong to. The Ashford estate wasn't what Meredith had imagined. There were no glaring golden gates, no statues, no showy fountains, just a long driveway curving through rows of ancient oak trees, and at the end of it, a gray stone house, standing silent in the snow, as if it had been there before the city itself was born. This was the kind of wealth that didn't need to prove anything, the kind of money that had stayed in one place long enough that it no longer had to impress anyone. Meredith recognized that the moment she stepped out of the car, she'd seen enough patience in her life to tell the difference between the newly rich and old families. The newly rich bought expensive watches and made sure the whole world saw them. Old families wore their grandfather's watch and never mentioned it. This house belonged to the second kind. The front door opened, and staff appeared from every direction, as if they'd been waiting. An older man in a black suit inclined his head to Keenan. A middle-aged woman with a stern face stepped forward to assist Margaret, and all of them, without exception, looked at Meredith. It wasn't a hostile stare, but it wasn't warm either. They were assessing her, weighing her, wondering who she was and why she was here. Meredith kept her face calm. She was used to being watched. 3 years with a controlling man had taught her how to keep her expression blank when she needed to. "Mrs. Everly will take my mother upstairs," Keenan said. His voice returned to the cold precision it had carried on the phone. But Margaret refused. She kept hold of Meredith's hand, tightening her grip when the middle-aged woman stepped closer. "Catherine is coming with me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She just came home. She isn't going anywhere else." Meredith looked at Keenan. He looked back at her, and for a fraction of a second, she saw the helplessness return to his eyes. "I'll stay with her for a while," Meredith said. She didn't know why she said it. She'd planned to wait until Margaret calmed down and then leave, but seeing the way Margaret held on to her, as if she were the last lifeline in the ocean, she couldn't walk away just yet. They moved into a wide sitting room with a fire burning in the hearth. Meredith helped Margaret into an armchair near the flames, and when a servant brought tea, she poured it herself. She'd done this hundreds of times at the hospital, making tea, tucking in blankets, sitting beside lonely, elderly people and listening to stories no one else wanted to hear. "Catherine," Margaret said, her hands trembling as she lifted the teacup. "Do you remember? You used to sing in the garden. Your voice was so beautiful. I loved listening to you sing." Meredith didn't correct her. She simply nodded softly and sat beside her. Margaret continued, her voice drifting between past and present, as if the line between them no longer existed. She spoke of birthday parties, of summer holidays, of a little girl who ran barefoot across the grass no matter how much her mother scolded her. The stories were tangled, out of order, but so full of love that Meredith felt her chest ache. Keenan had disappeared at some point. Maybe he had work to attend to. Maybe he couldn't bear hearing his mother speak about someone who was gone. Meredith didn't know, and she didn't ask. When Margaret began to doze, Meredith gently slipped her hand free and stood. She needed the restroom, and stopped a passing servant to ask. The servant gave directions, but the house was too large and the hallways too similar. Meredith took a wrong turn once, then again, and suddenly she found herself standing before a door left slightly open. A dim light spilled from inside. She knew she shouldn't look. This wasn't her home. It wasn't her business. But something held her there. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct. She pushed the door and stepped in. The room felt like a shrine. Photographs everywhere. On the walls, on the desk, on the shelves. All of them the same person. A girl with brown hair and a radiant smile. Catherine as a child riding a bicycle. Catherine as a teenager, in a formal gown. Catherine grown, holding Margaret on graduation day. Meredith stood there, staring at the photographs, and felt the blood in her veins slowly turn cold, because she understood now. Catherine and she weren't identical. No one would look at them and think they were sisters. But there was something. The curve of the face, the slight tilt at the corners of the eyes, the shade of hair in certain light. Small details a healthy mind would overlook, but a mind fading under Alzheimer's, a mind desperate to see the one it loved, would seize those details and rebuild a lost face from them. Meredith stood there, looking into Catherine's eyes in the largest photograph on the wall. She was staring at the face of someone dead, and that dead girl looked like her. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice came from behind her, low and cold, and Meredith didn't turn right away. She'd felt his presence before he spoke. There are people who enter a room and no one notices. And then there are men like Keenan Ashford, the kind of man the entire room senses the moment he appears. She turned slowly, unhurried, unafraid. She'd learned long ago that showing fear only excited predators. "I got lost," she said evenly. "I was looking for the restroom." Keenan stood in the doorway, his shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the frame. He didn't step inside. He just stood there, looking at her, then at the photographs on the walls, then back at her again. His gaze wasn't angry. It was something else, something Meredith couldn't quite read. "Who was Catherine?" she asked. She knew she shouldn't ask. It wasn't her business. She'd be gone in a few hours and would never see these people again. But she'd seen the photographs. She'd heard Margaret call her by that name. She needed to know. "My sister," Keenan said. 2 words, short, as if anything more would hurt. Meredith nodded slowly. She looked back at the largest photograph on the wall, Catherine smiling, alive, radiant. "She thinks I'm her," Meredith said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Keenan replied. Silence settled between them, heavy and thick. The room was filled with images of the dead, and 2 living people stood facing each other like opponents measuring the other's strength. Meredith didn't look away. She'd lived with a man who taught her that looking away was submission. She never looked away anymore. "She died 5 years ago," Keenan said, and something shifted in his voice. It wasn't entirely cold now. There was a crack somewhere beneath the surface. "Car accident. My mother never recovered. She started forgetting everything after the funeral. The doctors said it was how her mind coped with the loss." He paused, his jaw tightening. "She forgets who I am most of the time, but she never forgets Catherine." Meredith said nothing. There were no words that could soften that kind of pain. "I have a proposal," Keenan said, and his voice returned to its earlier precision, back under control, as if that brief moment of vulnerability had never existed. "Stay a few days. My mother is calmer with you here. She thinks you're Catherine, and that makes her happy. I'll pay you whatever amount you ask. Money isn't an issue." Meredith looked at him. She'd met enough people in her life to know when someone was trying to buy her, and she hated that feeling. She'd been bought once before. Her ex-husband bought her with attention, with promises, with the vision of a family she'd never had. The price she paid was 3 years in hell. "I don't need your money," she said, and her voice didn't tremble. Keenan blinked. Just once, barely noticeable, but Meredith saw it. She'd surprised him. "I don't work for you," she continued. "I'm not someone you can hire to play daughter for your mother. If I stay, it's because of her. Because she's hurting and she needs someone. Not because of you. Not because of your money." Keenan didn't respond. He simply stood there, studying her as if she were a creature he'd never encountered before. And maybe she was. Maybe in his world, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something. Everyone could be bought. Meredith wasn't that kind of person. She'd lost too much to believe that some things should ever be sold. "What do you want?" Keenan asked, and this time there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "Not money. Then what?" Meredith considered the question. What did she want? She wanted to go home. She wanted to sleep. She wanted to forget this night and return to her ordinary life. But she'd seen the way Margaret held her hand. She'd heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke about soup and the rose garden. She'd seen the pain in the eyes of a mother losing her memory yet still clinging to the love she carried for her daughter. "I want her to be okay," Meredith said quietly. "That's all." She stepped past him, out of the room, filled with photographs, without looking back. She didn't see the expression on Keenan's face then. She didn't see him remain there for several seconds, watching her leave, as if trying to solve an equation that had no answer. He'd met thousands of people in his life, people who feared him, people who wanted something from him, people who lowered their heads and called him sir. He didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't afraid of him and didn't want anything at all. The first few days drifted by as slowly as molasses. Meredith hadn't intended to stay long. She'd told herself 1 or 2 days, just until Margaret grew used to being without her, and then she would leave. But 1 day turned into 2. 2 turned into 3, and by the 4th day, she realized she'd formed a new routine. Each morning she woke early, brewed tea, and carried it to Margaret's room before she fully stirred. Margaret liked her Earl Grey with a touch of honey, and she liked to sip it while gazing out the window at the garden blanketed in white snow. Then came breakfast. Then reading. Margaret loved hearing Meredith read aloud, even though she often forgot the story within minutes. It didn't matter. Meredith simply began again. Margaret didn't remember, and Meredith didn't mind. In the afternoons, if the weather was warm enough, they sat in the winter garden where bare rose branches waited for spring. Margaret told stories, tangled stories that leapt from year to year, from one person to another, and Meredith listened to all of them. In the evenings, they played chess. Margaret still remembered the rules, even if she couldn't recall what she'd eaten for lunch. The human brain was strange that way. It held on to what had been repeated thousands of times and let go of what was new. Catherine, she called Meredith that name most of the time. 70%, if Meredith had to guess. The other 30% she called her kind girl, or sometimes simply child. But whatever she called her, Margaret was always happy to see her. And Meredith realized she was happy too. That frightened her more than anything else in this house. The house held secrets. Meredith wasn't blind. She saw black cars coming and going at odd hours. She saw men in expensive suits entering and leaving doors she wasn't permitted to approach. She heard the calls Keenan took at midnight, his voice like ice cutting through the walls. She saw the way the staff looked at him. It wasn't respect, it was fear. And she understood. She wasn't foolish. She'd lived long enough in Chicago to know there were kinds of power that weren't written into law books. There were men who ran this city from the shadows, and Keenan Ashford was one of them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't want details. She only wanted to care for an old woman losing her memory and then leave before she became entangled too deeply. But on the 5th day, Keenan found her. She was walking down the corridor, searching for the library Mrs. Everly had mentioned when he appeared as if from nowhere. "There are rules," he said. "No greeting. No introduction. The east wing of the house. You're not to go there." Meredith stopped. She looked at him, at the way he stood blocking the hallway, as if he owned not only the house, but the air inside it. "Why?" she asked. "Because I said so." She almost laughed. Almost. Because I said so. She'd heard that too many times. From caretakers at the orphanage, from employers who looked down on her, from her ex-husband whenever she dared ask why. "Fine," she said. "I'll avoid that area." Keenan tilted his head slightly, as if surprised by how easily she agreed. But Meredith wasn't finished. "But I'm not a prisoner here," she said, her voice steady. "You may have rules, but don't order me around like I'm your employee. I'm here because of her, not because of you. And if you want me gone, just say it. You'll never have to see me again." They stood facing each other in the middle of the corridor, and Meredith didn't look away. She'd spent 3 years lowering her eyes, 3 years apologizing for things that weren't her fault, 3 years shrinking herself so a man could feel larger. Never again. Keenan said nothing. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the shadowed hallway. Meredith remained there, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She didn't see Jonas standing at the corner, having witnessed the entire exchange. He watched Keenan walk away, then looked back at Meredith, and a faint smile touched his lips. No one said no to Keenan Ashford. No one in this house dared look him in the eye and say, "I'm not your employee." Jonas had been at Keenan's side for 15 years. He'd seen powerful men drop to their knees and beg. He'd seen enemies tremble at the sound of the Ashford name, and now he'd just watched a small-town nurse refuse to bow. "Interesting," Jonas murmured to himself before turning away. Meredith didn't hear him. She was already walking back down the corridor toward Margaret's room, her heart still racing. She was living in the house of a man the entire city feared, and she had just told him no to his face. 3 o'clock in the morning, and Meredith couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual. She'd grown used to sleepless nights long ago, from years of working night shifts at the hospital, from lying still and pretending to sleep while her ex-husband stumbled home drunk and she didn't dare breathe too loudly. Now, even though she was safe, even though she was free, her body hadn't forgotten. 3 in the morning was still the hour she woke with her heart racing, ears straining for footsteps that didn't exist. She decided to go downstairs for water instead of staring at the ceiling. The house was silent at night, in the way large houses often are. Not peaceful, hollow. Sound swallowed by long corridors and empty rooms. Meredith walked barefoot across the cold wooden floor, following the path she'd memorized after nearly a week here. But as she neared the kitchen, she stopped. There was light. Faint, not from the kitchen, but from the small office beside it, where she'd seen staff sort mail and documents. The door was slightly open. She knew she should turn back. It wasn't her business, but her feet didn't listen. She stepped closer, just enough to see through the narrow gap, and what she saw rooted her in place. Keenan Ashford sat there, alone, in the glow of a small desk lamp, without bodyguards, without a phone, without the polished cold authority he carried during the day. Just a man seated before a blank sheet of paper, a pen in his hand. He wrote something, a few lines, then stopped, looked at what he'd written, and tore the page apart. He pulled another sheet forward, wrote again, longer this time. The pen paused halfway through. He stared at the page as if it were an enemy. Then he ripped it up and tossed it onto the growing pile of paper scraps at his feet. Meredith stood in the darkness, barely breathing, and she understood. She understood exactly what he was doing. He was trying to write a letter to his mother, to the woman who called him by a stranger's name half the time, to the woman who looked at him with empty eyes and asked who he was, to the woman who was forgetting him day by day, piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. He was trying to write what he couldn't say aloud, but he couldn't find the words. Keenan Ashford, the man all of Chicago feared, the man who gave orders and was obeyed, the man who controlled everything within reach, was sitting here at 3 in the morning, unable to write a letter to his own mother. Meredith watched his face through the narrow opening and saw something she'd never seen before. No mask, no wall, no carefully constructed coldness, just pain, pure, unhidden. The kind of pain a child carries when he's losing his mother and doesn't know how to say goodbye. He wrote another line, looked at it, and this time he didn't tear it right away. He just sat there staring at the paper, and Meredith saw his shoulders tremble, just slightly, just for a moment. Then he drew in a deep breath, ripped the page into halves, then quarters, then smaller pieces, tossed it onto the pile, and reached for another blank sheet. Meredith stepped back. She turned and walked quietly to her room, forgetting all about the water she'd come for. Some pain doesn't need witnesses. Some moments of weakness deserve to remain private. She had no right to see that. Back in bed, she stared at the ceiling and thought about her ex-husband. He used to sit alone in the dark, too, but he drank. He shattered things. He turned his pain into anger and poured it over her. Every empty bottle meant a new bruise on her skin. Every sleepless night of his became a night of hell for her. This man was different. This man sat in the dark and tore paper. This man didn't spill his pain onto anyone else. He held it, swallowed it, let it eat him from the inside. Meredith didn't know whether that was better or worse. She only knew it was different, and she hated that she'd noticed. She hated that she was beginning to see him as a man instead of a symbol of power and danger. She hated that she remembered the way he'd said please on the first night, as if it had hurt him to say it. Stop, she told herself. Don't do this. Don't start caring. Don't start feeling sorry. Don't start seeing the human being inside dangerous men. She'd made that mistake once before. But the image of Keenan sitting alone in the yellow light, tearing page after page, trying to find a way to tell his mother he loved her before she forgot him completely, refused to leave her mind. He held an empire in his hands, but he couldn't find the words for his own mother. The day began like any other. Meredith brewed the tea, carried it to Margaret's room, and sat beside the window with her watching the snow begin to melt. But by mid-morning, everything shifted. Margaret didn't recognize her. Not in the usual way, not by calling her Catherine or kind girl. This time, she looked at Meredith as if she were an intruder. "Who are you?" Margaret shouted, her voice trembling and sharp as glass. "What are you doing in my room? Get out right now." Meredith kept her tone calm. "Mrs. Ashford, it's Meredith. I've been here with you for days. Don't you remember? We played chess last night." But Margaret didn't hear her. She stood so abruptly that her chair toppled backward, and she began throwing whatever she could reach. A teacup shattered against the floor. Books fell like wounded birds. She screamed names Meredith didn't know, calling for people to save her from the stranger in her room. Mrs. Everly rushed in. 2 other staff members followed. They tried to steady Margaret, but she fought them, stronger than Meredith would have believed a 74-year-old woman could be. Meredith stepped closer slowly, hands raised so Margaret could see she meant no harm. "Mrs. Ashford," she said gently. "I won't hurt you. I only want to help." Margaret froze. She stared at Meredith, eyes wild, breath coming fast, and then she spoke, her voice suddenly cold as stone. "Why don't you just leave?" Meredith didn't move. "Everyone leaves," Margaret said, and the anger drained from her voice, leaving something tired, something wounded. "My husband left. Catherine left. Everyone leaves me. You'll leave too. So why not go now? Why pretend you're staying?" The words struck Meredith like a slap. Not because Margaret meant to hurt her. She didn't know what she was saying. But the words "everyone leaves" echoed inside Meredith's head like a warning bell. She knew that feeling. She knew it too well. Her parents had left her at an orphanage when she was too young to remember their faces. Families had visited, looked her over, and chosen another child. Friends had promised to stay in touch, and then disappeared. A husband had sworn he'd love her forever, and then turned that love into a private hell. Everyone leaves. She'd heard that sentence her whole life, but she'd never imagined she would hear it from the other side. Margaret finally calmed. The medication, Mrs. Everly gave her, began to take effect, and she drifted to sleep on the bed, tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. Meredith helped clean the room in silence. She gathered the broken pieces of the teacup, stacked the fallen books, and tried not to think at all. But that night, she packed. She didn't have much. A small bag she'd brought on the first evening, when she believed she'd stay only a few hours. A few changes of clothes Mrs. Everly had arranged for her. The book she'd been reading aloud to Margaret. She placed everything inside, zipped it closed, and stood at the door. The hallway beyond was dark. She could leave now, call a taxi, go home, return to her ordinary life, return to the safety of solitude. No one could abandon her if she never let anyone close. No one could disappoint her if she expected nothing. She'd lived that way for 2 years after her divorce. Alone, safe, untouched. She could keep living that way. She should. She was afraid. Not of Keenan, not of the shadowed world she'd stepped into. She was afraid of herself. Afraid that she'd begun to care about Margaret. Afraid that she'd begun to understand Keenan. Afraid that she'd started to feel, even faintly, as if she belonged here. She was afraid of being hurt again. And she knew, with a certainty that tightened her chest, that if she stayed longer, she would be hurt. There was no other outcome. She placed her hand on the doorknob. "Are you leaving?" Meredith turned. Mrs. Everly stood at the far end of the corridor, her hair more silver than not, her face worn from a long day. There was no accusation in her voice, only a simple question. Meredith didn't answer. "I don't blame you," Mrs. Everly said as she walked closer. "Today was hard. She didn't mean it. She has no control when it happens." "I know," Meredith whispered. "She'll ask for you," Mrs. Everly continued. "In the morning, when she wakes, she always asks where Catherine is. And if you're not here, she'll believe Catherine left again." Meredith closed her eyes. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to feel responsible. "You don't owe her anything," Mrs. Everly said softly. "I know you have your own life, but I've been in this house 15 years. I've watched her lose her husband, lose her daughter, lose her memory, and I've never seen her as peaceful as she is when you're beside her." The housekeeper said nothing more. She simply turned and disappeared into the darkness. Meredith stood there, her hand still on the knob, her bag slung over her shoulder. She could go. No one would stop her. But she thought of Margaret, of the way she held her hand on good days, of the way she smiled when Meredith read to her, of the way she'd said everyone leaves with eyes that had watched too many people walk away. Meredith lowered the bag. She wasn't staying for Keenan. She wasn't staying for money. She was staying because she couldn't be one more person who left. She'd been left too many times in her life to forget how that felt. And she couldn't do that to an old woman who was losing everything piece by piece. She turned back into her room. She set the bag on the floor. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. She had almost run. But some people can't survive being left one more time. A week after the night she almost left, Meredith made a mistake. Not on purpose. She would never deliberately break a rule Keenan had set. The East Wing was forbidden, and she'd respected that. But that day Margaret was having a good day, one of those rare mornings when she was almost herself, and she wanted to walk through the house. She said she was looking for an old photo album. "Somewhere in the house. I can't remember where," she told Meredith. "Will you help me find it, Catherine?" And Meredith, unable to refuse, guided her along. They wandered down corridor after corridor, opening doors, searching for an album that might no longer exist, or might never have been where Margaret believed it was. Somewhere along the way, Meredith realized she was lost. These hallways looked different, darker, fewer windows, no staff moving about. Margaret grew tired, and Mrs. Everly arrived to take her back to her room to rest. Meredith remained alone in the unfamiliar corridor, trying to retrace her steps. She turned left, then right, and that was when she heard a voice, Keenan's voice, but not the one she'd heard before. Not the cool, controlled tone he used with her, not the softened voice he carried when speaking to his mother. This was something else, colder, sharper, like a blade honed too fine. She knew she should turn back, knew she shouldn't be here, but her feet refused to listen. She moved closer to a half-open door, just enough to see inside. The room looked like an office, a large oak desk, bookshelves reaching to the ceiling, and in the center of the room, a man knelt on the floor. He looked about 40, dressed in an expensive suit, now wrinkled and soaked with sweat. He was trembling so violently Meredith could see it from where she stood. In front of him stood Keenan, not shouting, not striking. He didn't need to do anything at all. He simply stood there, looking down at the man kneeling at his feet, and he spoke. "You took my money," Keenan said, his tone as calm as if he were reading a weather report. $200,000 in 6 months. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I didn't check. You thought I was foolish." The man was crying, tears streaming down his face, mixing with sweat. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "I can explain. My wife is sick. The hospital bills. I was going to pay it back. I swear." Keenan's expression didn't change. "They always apologize," he said, almost to himself. "They always have a reason. A sick wife. A child who needs tuition. A mother who needs surgery." He looked down at the man, and his eyes were ice. "I don't care." The man sobbed harder, hands pressed together as if in prayer. "Please, my family, my children. I'm giving you 24 hours, Keenan said, cutting through the pleading as if it were nothing. 24 hours to return every cent. If not, Your family will need to find new employment. All of them. Your wife is at Mount Sinai, isn't she? Oncology. It would be very difficult for her to continue treatment if no one were willing to accept her as a patient. The man went silent. Tears still fell, but he couldn't speak. He understood. Meredith understood too. This wasn't a threat of violence. There were no guns, no knives, no blood, but it was something more ruthless. This was a man who could dismantle an entire life with a single phone call. Keenan turned away. He walked toward the window and looked outside as if the man kneeling on the floor no longer existed. "Jonas," he called. "See him out." A side door opened, and Jonas entered. He pulled the man to his feet, not roughly, but not gently either, and led him out through another door. Meredith stepped back. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. Her hands trembled. Her legs felt weak. She retreated another step, then another. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from directly behind her, and Meredith nearly cried out. She turned. Jonas stood there, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on her. He must have circled through the main entrance without her noticing. "I know," Meredith said, her voice hoarse. Jonas studied her for a long moment. He didn't threaten her, didn't warn her. He simply looked. "Come with me," he said at last. "I'll take you back to your room." Meredith followed him in silence. She didn't glance back at the office where Keenan still stood by the window. She didn't want to look. She'd seen enough. She'd known he was dangerous from the first night, when 3 black SUVs arrived and 6 men moved like soldiers. She'd known what kind of house she was in, but knowing and seeing were 2 different things. Now she had seen. She had seen the way he looked down at a grown man sobbing at his feet without a flicker of mercy. She had seen the way he threatened to unravel an entire family, with a voice as calm as if he were ordering coffee. She had seen his real world, and she believed she had seen the real man. Or at least, that was what she thought then. She had always known he was dangerous. Now she had witnessed it. Jonas didn't take her back to her room right away. He led her instead to a small room at the end of the corridor, a kind of staff sitting room with simple chairs and a narrow table, a kettle still warm on its base. He poured 2 cups of tea, slid one toward her, and sat down across from her. Meredith didn't drink. She stared at the steam rising from the cup and tried to steady the rhythm of her heart. "You saw," Jonas said. It wasn't a question. Meredith didn't answer. "Are you afraid?" She lifted her eyes to him. Jonas had the kind of face that had witnessed too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He wasn't threatening her. He was genuinely asking. She was quiet for a long time. She thought about what she'd just seen. The man on his knees, the tears, the pleading, and Keenan standing there, cold as stone, dismantling a life without so much as blinking. She should have been afraid. Any reasonable person would have been. "I lived with a man who beat me every night for 3 years, she said at last, her voice so steady it surprised even her. "He laughed in my face every morning like nothing had happened. He bought me flowers after making me bleed. He told me he loved me while his hands were around my throat." Jonas didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his expression unchanged, though something in his eyes shifted. Not pity. Meredith hated pity. Perhaps understanding. "He's dangerous," Meredith said quietly, nodding toward the direction of the room she'd just left. "I'm not foolish. I saw what I saw. But he doesn't pretend he isn't dangerous. There's a difference." She held Jonas's gaze. "My ex-husband pretended to be good. He wore a mask for the world and only took it off when it was just me. Keenan doesn't pretend. He is exactly what he is, and strangely, that's easier to live with." Jonas was silent for a moment. He took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and studied her in a way she couldn't quite decipher. "You're the first person he hasn't sent away within 24 hours, Jonas said. Meredith blinked. She didn't understand. "I've been with him 15 years, Jonas continued. "I've seen people come and go, housekeepers, doctors, nurses hired to care for Mrs. Ashford. None of them lasted more than a day. He always found a reason to dismiss them. Always." "Why?" Meredith asked. "Because he doesn't trust anyone." Jonas said it as plainly as if he were stating the color of the sky. "He has his reasons, but they aren't mine to share." He paused, then added more softly, "You're not like the others who walk into this house. They want money, power, something from him. Everyone wants something. But you don't seem to want anything." Meredith considered that. What did she want? She'd already answered that question once. I want her to be okay, she said again. Margaret, I want her to have someone beside her in the end. I don't want her to be alone. That's all. Jonas watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. He isn't a bad man, Jonas said, and there was something almost protective in his tone. He does bad things, but he isn't a bad man. Is there a difference? Meredith asked. That's a good question, Jonas replied. I've been trying to answer it for 15 years. He stood, pushed his chair back into place, and looked down at her. If you're going to stay, be careful. Of him? She asked. No. Jonas shook his head. Of yourself. This place changes people. You think you're only here for Margaret. You think you'll leave when it's over and return to your ordinary life. But this house doesn't work that way. It pulls you in. Slowly, quietly, and by the time you notice, you're not the same person you used to be. Meredith didn't respond. She watched him walk to the door, pause at the threshold, then glance back. You're a good person, he said. I don't meet many good people in this line of work. I hope this place doesn't change that. Then he left her alone with a cup of tea gone cold, and thoughts she didn't yet know how to carry. That morning, Margaret woke and was herself. Not completely, not ever completely anymore, but enough that her eyes were clearer than usual. Enough that she remembered Meredith wasn't Catherine, even though she still slipped and used the wrong name now and then. These were the days Meredith had learned to treasure. Brief windows when the illness stepped back and allowed Margaret to truly live, if only for a few hours. I want to go to the garden, Margaret said after breakfast. Will you take me out there? The snow had nearly melted, and the February sun rested over the winter garden with a pale but gentle warmth. Meredith wrapped another coat around Margaret's shoulders, placed a knit hat over her silver hair, and guided her through the glass doors at the back of the house. The garden looked different without its blanket of snow. Meredith could see flower beds waiting for spring, shrubs trimmed neatly, and at the center, a section devoted entirely to roses. Bare branches now, gray-brown and thin, but she could imagine how beautiful they would be in bloom. Margaret led her to the largest rose tree, an old one with a thick, weathered trunk and branches stretching outward like arms embracing the sky. This one is older than I am, Margaret said, resting her palm against the bark, as if greeting an old friend. It was here when I first came to this house as a bride. She smiled softly, her gaze drifting somewhere far away. Catherine used to hide things here when she was little. She dug a small hole at the base of the tree and buried all sorts of treasures. Candy, letters, toys. She thought no one knew. A quiet laugh escaped her. But I knew. I always knew. I just pretended I didn't. Then she fell silent. The light in her eyes dimmed as the memory slipped through her fingers like water. What was I saying? She asked, confusion returning. You were talking about the garden, Meredith answered gently. About how you like sitting here. Yes. Margaret nodded, accepting the explanation as if it were solid ground. I like sitting here. They found a stone bench nearby and sat. Margaret told stories, fragments about people Meredith didn't know, about summers long gone, about a man Meredith assumed was Keenan's father. The stories wandered from year to year, untethered and out of order, but Keenan arrived quietly and sat beside them without interrupting. Meredith almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't wearing his usual black suit, just a shirt and dark trousers. Simpler, less intimidating. And he was alone. No Jonas. No guards. Son, Margaret called brightly, her voice filled with the simple joy of a child greeting someone she loves. You came to sit with me. Keenan didn't answer. He lowered himself onto the bench, leaving a small space between them, as if unsure whether he had the right to close it. Margaret continued talking, about the roses, about old summers, about laughter that once filled the air. Keenan listened. He didn't correct her when she confused details. He didn't guide her back when she lost the thread. He simply listened. And Meredith saw him look at his mother with something she'd never witnessed on his face before. Tenderness, pain, love. Then Margaret did something that made them both still. She took Keenan's hand with her right. She took Meredith's with her left. And she said, her voice full of contentment, "Both my children are here." Meredith didn't know how to respond. She wasn't Margaret's child. She was a stranger who happened to resemble the daughter she'd lost. But Margaret held her hand with all the warmth of a mother's love. and Meredith couldn't pull away. She glanced at Keenan. He was staring at their joined hands, and she saw his fingers tighten just slightly around his mother's, enough to tell her it mattered. They sat that way for a long while, the winter sun resting gently over them. After some time, Keenan turned to Meredith and asked a question she didn't expect. "Which hospital do you work at?" It was an ordinary question, the kind people ask when they're getting to know someone. But from him, it felt unfamiliar, as though he were trying to speak a language he hadn't practiced in years. "Mount Sinai," she said. "Emergency department." He nodded. "How long?" 5 years. He asked a few more questions about her shifts, about the pace of the work. Small questions, slightly awkward, as if he wasn't used to conversation that didn't involve orders or negotiations. Meredith answered just as awkwardly, unsettled by this quieter version of him, the man who sat in a garden with his mother and asked about her work as though it truly interested him. That night, she couldn't sleep. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Catherine used to hide things here. The sentence wouldn't let her rest. Close to midnight, she pulled on her coat and slipped outside. Moonlight washed the garden in silver, bright enough for her to find the old rose tree. She knelt, the cold earth seeping through her clothes, and began to dig with her hands. She didn't know what she expected to find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps she was foolish. But her fingers struck something solid. Metal. She cleared the dirt and lifted out a small tin box, old and rusted at the corners. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside lay a single envelope. The paper had yellowed with time, but the handwriting was still clear. "For Keenan. Only open when Mom no longer recognizes you." Meredith stared at the envelope, her pulse quickening. Catherine's handwriting. A letter from the dead to the living. A secret buried beneath the roots of a rose tree, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. She was holding the secret of someone who no longer breathed, and she had no idea it was about to change everything. Meredith didn't sleep that night. She lay on her bed with the envelope resting on the table beside her, staring at it as if it might bite. She was holding someone else's secret in her hands, and didn't know what to do with it. She could have opened it. No one would have known. No one would have found out. But that wasn't who she was. She'd lived her whole life with her boundaries crossed. Her ex-husband read her messages, checked her phone, opened her mail. He'd never understood the concept of privacy. She wouldn't become that kind of person. The next morning, after making sure Margaret was settled with Mrs. Everly, she went looking for Keenan. He was in the study, the same room where she'd once seen him tearing paper at 3 a.m. He sat behind his desk, reading something on his laptop, and when she knocked, he looked up with the irritation of a man interrupted. That expression shifted when he saw her, not softened entirely, but less sharp. "Come in," he said. Meredith stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She walked to his desk, took the envelope from her coat pocket, and placed it between them. "I found this in the garden," she said. "Mrs. Ashford mentioned Catherine used to hide things beneath the old rose tree. I was curious. I dug, and I found it." Keenan looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. He only stared, and Meredith watched the color drain from his face. He recognized the handwriting. Of course he did. It was his sister's. His hand rested on the desk, and Meredith saw it tremble. Just slightly, enough for her to notice. He was trying to control his reaction, but his body betrayed him. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "No. Why not?" Meredith met his eyes. "Because it isn't my secret." He looked at her for a long moment, as if she were something he couldn't quite comprehend. She'd held that letter all night. She could have opened it without anyone ever knowing. But she hadn't. She returned it untouched and told him it wasn't hers. No one did that. In his world, people collected information. They searched for leverage. Everyone wanted something. But she handed the envelope back as if it had never belonged to her, because it hadn't. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as though he rarely used them. Meredith nodded and turned to leave. She'd done what she needed to do. The letter was back where it belonged. She had no reason to stay. "Stay." His voice stopped her. She turned. Keenan was watching her, the envelope still on the desk between them, and his expression was something she'd never seen before. Not a command, not an order, almost a plea, like the night in the snow when he'd said please. "Stay," he repeated, softer this time, while I read it. Meredith stood there, uncertain. She didn't belong in this moment. This was a letter from his sister, his family's private grief. She was an outsider, but he was looking at her like a man who didn't want to face something alone, and she understood that feeling. She sat down in the chair across from him. She didn't speak. She simply remained, letting him know she was there. Keenan reached for the envelope. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and his face darkened. Meredith didn't know who was calling, but she recognized the look. It was important. The kind of call he usually answered immediately, whether it came at midnight or during a meal. He looked at the phone, then at the envelope, then at her, and he silenced it. "It can wait," he said, turning the phone face down on the desk. Meredith said nothing, but she understood what she'd just witnessed. For the first time, he had placed something above his work, above his empire, above the late-night calls and secret meetings and men kneeling at his feet. He placed his sister's letter above all of it, and he didn't want to read it alone. He opened the envelope slowly, carefully, as if it might break. Inside were several handwritten pages. Catherine's script. Neat, clear, filled with love. He began to read, and Meredith sat there in silence, so he wouldn't have to be alone with what his sister had left behind. Keenan drew the pages from the envelope with hands he tried to steady, and didn't quite succeed. Meredith didn't look at the letter. She watched his face. She'd learned long ago that a face can tell more truth than any spoken word. He began to read in silence. His eyes moved across the lines, and she saw his expression change piece by piece, like ice thawing under slow sunlight. First surprise, then confusion, then something deeper, heavier, something that hurt too much to name. He stopped at one paragraph, read it again, and then he began to read aloud, as if he needed to hear the words in his own voice to believe they were real. "My Keenan," he read, his voice rough. "If you're reading this, it means Mom no longer recognizes you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you have to live through that. I'm sorry I'm not there to hold your hand." He swallowed and continued. "But there are things you need to know. Things I tried to tell you for years, but you never let me close enough. You build walls, Keenan. You build them with everyone, even with me. And I understand why. I know what you're afraid of." Meredith saw his fingers tighten around the paper until his knuckles turned white. "I know the secret," he read on. "I've known since I was 16. I overheard Mom and Dad talking. About your birth mother. About how she left when you were 10. About how you aren't Mom's biological son." He stopped, closed his eyes for a second as if bracing himself. "I know what you've believed all your life, Keenan. I know you think Mom kept you out of duty. Because Dad insisted. Because she didn't have a choice. I know you've carried that belief like a stone inside you. I know that's why you never let anyone close. Because if even your own mother didn't truly want you, how could anyone else?" His voice shook. Meredith had never heard it do that before. "But you were wrong," he read, almost breaking on the words. "Completely wrong. Mom didn't raise you out of obligation. She chose you. I asked her once, when I was old enough to ask. I asked why she took in the child of the woman who shattered her marriage. And she told me, in the calmest voice I've ever heard, that you weren't responsible for the sins of adults. You were just a little boy who needed love, and she chose to love you." Keenan stared at the page as if it had struck him. "You may not share her blood," he read softly, "but you are her son. From the day she held your hand and said you stay here with me, you became hers, not because she had to, not because she was forced, because she chose you. Every day, for 26 years, she chose you." He turned the page, his hands trembling more now. "Stop being afraid, Keenan," he read. "She loves you, not because you were a burden she had to carry. Because you are you. Because you were the little boy who cried alone in the corner on his first night in this house, and she sat beside you for 3 hours until you fell asleep. Because you were the teenager who pretended to be tough but still bought her flowers every birthday. Because you are the man who built an empire but still came home for Sunday dinner. She loves you, and I love you. I wish you had let me say this while I was alive. I tried, so many times, but you never let me close enough. You always found a way to push me away like you push everyone. So I'm writing instead. I'm hiding this where I know one day it will be found. And I hope that when you read it, you'll finally understand. You are loved, Keenan. You always have been. Don't let fear steal another day of your life. Your sister, Catherine." Keenan set the pages down on the desk. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He simply sat there in complete stillness. Meredith watched him and understood that this wasn't the silence of a man controlling his emotions. It was the silence of someone whose entire foundation had just shifted. The silence of a man forced to redefine his own history. 36 years. He'd lived 36 years believing his mother kept him out of duty. He'd built walls against the world because he believed no one truly wanted him. He'd pushed his sister away because he was afraid that if she came too close, she'd see he wasn't worthy of love. 36 years built on a story he told himself. 36 years shaped by fear. And now, in a few pages of careful handwriting, that fear had been dismantled. He had been afraid for 36 years, and it had never been the truth. The silence stretched on. Meredith didn't know how long. Maybe a minute. Maybe 10. Time lost its meaning in that room where a man had just finished reading a letter that dismantled everything he'd believed about his own life. Keenan remained seated, staring at the pages on the desk, but his eyes weren't truly seeing them anymore. He was looking somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the walls, maybe into the past, maybe into the years he'd wasted fearing something that had never been true. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he said at last. His voice rough as if he'd been shouting for hours, though he'd barely spoken at all. Meredith didn't answer. She simply listened. "I've been afraid of this my entire life," Keenan said. "Afraid she kept me out of obligation. Afraid I was a burden she couldn't escape. Afraid that every time she looked at me, she saw the woman who betrayed her." He let out a hollow laugh, empty of humor. "I was so afraid that I never asked, never gave her the chance to tell me the truth, because I was terrified the truth would confirm what I believed." He looked down at the letter again. "And Catherine knew. She knew everything. She tried to tell me. So many times." He drew in a shaking breath. "She used to come to my room late at night, say she wanted to talk, say there was something important I needed to know. And what did I do? I told her to go to bed. I said I was busy. I found every excuse not to listen, because I was afraid she would say something that made it real." His voice broke on the last words. "I built walls," he whispered, "with everyone, even the one person who was trying to help me, even my sister. She died without ever saying what she wanted to say, because I never gave her the chance." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders trembled. There were no loud sobs, no dramatic collapse, just silence and the quiet shaking of a man finally facing the truth he'd avoided for decades. Meredith didn't know what to say. There were no words that could erase 36 years of fear, nothing she could offer that would bring Catherine back or give him another chance. But she could be present. She rose from her chair and walked around the desk. There was a small sofa against the wall that she hadn't noticed earlier. She sat beside him. She didn't speak. She simply reached for his hand. It was cold beneath her fingers. She felt the tremor still running through it. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just let her hold it, and she felt some of the tension in his body begin to loosen. Meredith understood this kind of pain. She understood it too well. She had built walls of her own. After 3 years in a marriage that felt like a private war, she'd learned not to trust anyone. She'd pushed people away before they could leave her, before they could hurt her. If she didn't let anyone close, no one could wound her. She was still doing it. Even now, even sitting here, holding the hand of a man in pain, part of her was screaming to stand up and walk out. Don't get involved. Don't care. Don't let him close enough to break you. But she didn't move. She stayed, because sometimes what a person needs isn't advice, not solutions, not reassurances that everything will be fine. Sometimes what a person needs is simply to know they aren't alone. They sat there in silence. Keenan didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. Their shoulders nearly touched, her hand still resting over his, and for the first time since she'd stepped into this house, there was no wall between them, no mask, no defense, just two people who had both been shaped by loss, sitting side by side in a quiet room, finding a small measure of peace in the presence of the other. She didn't try to fix him. She couldn't. No one could undo decades of fear with a few gentle words or a steady hand. But she could remain. She could let him know he didn't have to face this alone. And sometimes, that is enough. In the days after the letter, Meredith began to notice something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Not the kind of transformation that announces itself. Keenan was still Keenan. still cold with outsiders, still running his empire in a voice stripped of emotion, still capable of making men in expensive suits lower their eyes when he passed. But there were small things, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. That morning, when Meredith brought Margaret down to breakfast, Keenan was already there, not reading the paper, not checking his phone, just sitting at the table, waiting. Normally he ate alone in his study. Mrs. Everly had mentioned that the first week. He prefers to eat alone, but now he was there. And the next morning too, and the one after that. He didn't speak much during breakfast. He simply listened while his mother told her scattered stories, nodding occasionally, asking a quiet question to keep her talking. And when Margaret took his hand and called him by a name that wasn't his, he didn't pull away the way he once had. He held on. He began spending more afternoons with her. Sometimes, when Meredith read aloud, she would glance up and see him standing in the doorway. He never interrupted, never entered fully, just stood there for a few minutes, listening, before walking away. But even that was new. He began asking Meredith about Margaret. How was she today? Did she remember anything? Was she happy? Small questions, careful ones, as if he were relearning how to care after years of forgetting how. And then the conversations began to stretch beyond Margaret. One evening, after Margaret had fallen asleep, Meredith was sitting in the sitting room with a book when Keenan appeared. He took the chair across from her and said nothing, just stared out the window. She assumed he wanted solitude and started to rise. "You don't have to leave," he said. "Stay." She sat back down. They remained in silence for a long time before he asked, "Where did you grow up?" The question caught her off guard. Meredith wasn't used to being asked about herself. She was accustomed to listening, not being listened to. "An orphanage," she said. "Outside Boston." He didn't react with exaggerated sympathy, didn't look at her with pity. He simply nodded and waited, and she kept speaking. She didn't know why. Maybe the dim light made honesty easier. Maybe because he'd shown her the most vulnerable part of himself, and she felt compelled to answer with equal truth. Maybe because she'd carried these words alone for too long. "I stayed there until I was 18, she said. "No one adopted me. They said I was too quiet. Couples want bright children, smiling children. I sat in corners and read. No one wanted that." He listened. "That was all. I met my ex-husband when I was 22, she continued. He was the first person who said he wanted me. The first who looked at me like I mattered. I thought that was love." She gave a brittle laugh. "He beat me for 3 years, and I stayed, because I believed no one else would want me, because I thought that was all I deserved, because I was terrified that if I left, I would become that unchosen child again." She stopped. She'd said too much. More than she'd told anyone. More than she'd admitted even to herself. "I'm afraid to trust anyone again," she said quietly. "Afraid to stay anywhere too long. Afraid to care and then lose it. Afraid to let someone close and watch them become someone I don't recognize." Silence followed, heavy. She expected something rehearsed, a hollow reassurance, a shallow "I understand," or worse, pity. But Keenan didn't offer any of that. "You stayed," he said. 3 simple words. Meredith looked at him. "Even afraid," he continued. "Even after everything you just told me, you stayed. With my mother. In this house. You're still here. I don't know why," she whispered. And she meant it. She had planned to leave more than once. She had every reason to go. But she hadn't. "I do," Keenan said. He looked at her, and in the faint light from the window she saw his expression soften. "Because you're someone who doesn't leave. That's who you are. You're the woman who stops for an old lady in the snow at 2 a.m. when you have every reason to walk past. You're the woman who stays after being told to go. You're the woman who holds a man's hand while he reads the letter that breaks his world apart. You don't leave. That's your nature." Meredith didn't speak. She didn't know how to answer. She simply sat there in the dim room and felt something inside her chest loosen. She had told him more than she had ever told anyone. The secrets she'd buried for years, the scars she hid behind calmness and competence. She had shown him the ugliest parts of her past, and he hadn't recoiled. He hadn't looked at her differently. He hadn't offered pity or disgust. He had remained, sitting across from her in the quiet, and somehow, that meant more than any promise ever could. The message arrived at 7 sharp, cutting through the morning silence. Meredith had just woken and was still lying in bed staring at the ceiling when her phone vibrated on the nightstand. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was spam. But she opened it anyway, and the blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. "You don't belong there. Leave while you still can." No name, no explanation. Just 2 short sentences, cold and deliberate. A warning, or a threat. Meredith sat up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. She read the message again, and again, as if repetition might dull the edge of it. It didn't. She knew what she had to do. She found Jonas in the hallway near Margaret's room, where he stood each morning reviewing schedules with another guard. The moment he saw her pale face, he dismissed the other man with a glance. "What happened?" Jonas asked, his voice sharpening immediately. Meredith didn't speak. She simply handed him her phone. He read the message, and she watched his expression darken. Not fear. Jonas didn't frighten easily. This was something else. Focus. The kind that belongs to a predator who has just scented danger. "When did you receive this?" he asked. "A few minutes ago." He nodded, studying the number on the screen, then handed the phone back. "Go to your room. Don't leave until I return." He was gone before she could ask anything. Meredith did as she was told. She didn't know how afraid she was supposed to be. She'd known where she was. She'd seen how Keenan operated. She understood this wasn't an ordinary world. But she'd never imagined she might become part of the battlefield. An hour later, Jonas returned with news that felt heavier than the message itself. "The Moreno family," he said. "Ashford's rivals. They've been watching this estate for weeks. They know about Mrs. Ashford, and now they know about you." He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw real concern in his eyes. "You're a new vulnerability. They believe you matter to him. They want you to understand they can reach you whenever they choose." "I don't matter to anyone," Meredith said quietly. "I'm just the nurse caring for his mother." Jonas didn't answer. He simply looked at her in a way that made her chest tighten. After that, everything shifted. Security tightened overnight. Guards appeared at every turn. Meredith wasn't allowed beyond the main wing of the house, not into the garden alone, not anywhere without at least 2 men nearby. The estate no longer felt merely large. It felt like a fortress. Or a cage. Keenan found her that afternoon in the sitting room. She was pretending to read when he walked in, and she knew instantly something had hardened in him again. The brief warmth she'd grown used to was gone. This was the Keenan from the first night, the man of boardrooms and kneeling adversaries. "Circumstances have changed," he said. "You should consider leaving. This isn't your world." Meredith lowered the book slowly. She met his eyes without flinching. "Are you dismissing me? I'm protecting you." "I don't need you to protect me," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "I decide whether I stay or go, not you." He went silent, his jaw tightened. She could see the conflict flickering behind his composure. The instinct to control the situation as he always had. The instinct to shield her. "You aren't safe here," he said at last. "I can't guarantee anything." "You can never guarantee anything," Meredith answered softly. "That's life." He studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and left without another word. Meredith thought that was the end of it. He wanted her gone. He'd made that clear. But that night, when she stepped into the hallway for water, she counted 4 guards positioned near her door. Twice as many as before. He hadn't told her to stay, but he'd doubled the protection around her. He told her she should leave. Yet he quietly ensured she would be safer if she didn't. Lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Meredith thought about Keenan Ashford. He didn't know how to say "I care." He didn't know how to put concern into words. He knew how to act. He built walls with language and dismantled them through action. He pushed her away with words and held her in place with protection. She didn't know which version of him to believe. That morning, Margaret woke different. Meredith knew the instant her eyes opened. There was something in them, clear, focused, like a candle burning brightest just before it goes out. Meredith had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize it. Terminal patients sometimes have one miraculous day. A day of perfect clarity, as if illness has loosened its grip. Doctors call it terminal lucidity. Families call it a miracle. But people like Meredith, who've seen too much, know it's often a farewell. "Child," Margaret said, her voice clearer than Meredith had ever heard it. "Meredith, that's your name, isn't it?" "Not Catherine." Meredith's heart tightened. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Meredith." Margaret smiled, a sad and peaceful smile. "I know. I've always known. Sometimes my mind just doesn't let me hold on to it. But today I remember. Today I remember everything." Meredith didn't trust herself to speak. She simply took Margaret's hand and fought the sting of tears. "Call Keenan for me," Margaret said. "I need to speak to my son." Keenan arrived within 5 minutes. He must have been nearby. Perhaps Jonas had already warned him. He stepped into the room, composed as always. But when he saw the lucidity in his mother's eyes, he stopped. "Mom," he said. Just one word, but it carried an ocean inside it. "Come sit with me, son," Margaret said, patting the bed beside her. Keenan crossed the room and sat. And for the first time, Meredith saw not the man who commanded fear, not the architect of an empire, but a son. "Mom knows you read Catherine's letter," Margaret said gently. Keenan went still. "I knew where she hid it. I knew all along. I was waiting until you were ready to find it yourself." "Mom," he began, but she placed her hand against his mouth. "Let me speak. I don't know how much time I have to say what needs saying." He fell silent. She looked at him, her eyes clear as autumn water, full of love and a strange peace. "You are my son," Margaret said. "You always have been. Not because of blood, not because of obligation, because I chose you. I chose you every day since you were 10 years old. Since I saw a frightened little boy abandoned by his mother and decided that boy deserved to be loved." Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "And I will choose you every day until I forget how to choose, until my mind no longer lets me remember who you are. But even then, Keenan, even when I look at you and don't recognize your face, the love will still be there. It lives deeper than memory, in a place this illness cannot reach." Meredith saw Keenan's shoulders shake. He tried to hold himself together, tried to wear the mask he'd worn his whole life, but it failed him now. "You don't have to be strong in front of me," Margaret said softly. "You never did." And Keenan Ashford, the man Chicago feared, the man who never cried in front of anyone, lowered his head to his mother's shoulder and wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears and trembling shoulders, like a son being held for the last time while his mother was still fully herself. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, smoothed his hair like he was still a boy. She cried too, but she was smiling. After a long while, she turned her gaze to Meredith. "You're still here," she said. Meredith nodded, tears slipping down her own cheeks. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for sitting with me in the snow that night. You didn't have to stop, but you did." She smiled. "Catherine would have liked you. She stopped for strangers too. She had a heart like yours." Meredith couldn't find words. She simply held Margaret's hand tighter. "Good things are coming," Margaret said, her voice almost prophetic. "I can feel it. For both of you. You feel it too, don't you? Don't be afraid of it. Don't let fear steal what you deserve." She looked at her son leaning against her and the young woman holding her hand, and there was contentment in her eyes. And then, like a candle finally blown out, the light faded. The focus slipped away. The clarity dissolved like mist in sunlight. Margaret blinked, glanced around, and when she looked at Meredith, recognition was gone. Only the familiar confusion remained. "Catherine," she murmured gently. "Are you hungry? I'll make you soup, the kind you like." Meredith looked at Keenan. He had lifted his head, eyes still red, and the grief in them was quiet but immense. The moment had passed. Margaret had returned to the place the illness kept her. But her words lingered, in the air, in their chests. Some truths don't need to be remembered to remain real. It was the last time Margaret was completely herself, and she used it to say what mattered most. That night, Meredith didn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, and she thought about Margaret, about the words she'd spoken in that rare, shining clarity, about Keenan weeping against his mother's shoulder like a child, about the way he'd looked at her afterward, eyes red, his face stripped of every wall he'd ever built. She was falling into something she couldn't control. She knew it now. She'd known it for a while but had pretended not to see. She told herself she was here for Margaret, for a lonely old woman who needed someone beside her. But the truth was far more complicated. Keenan Ashford was a dangerous man. His world was a place where threats arrived by text at 7 o'clock in the morning, and guards shadowed her steps like a second skin. His world was filled with men kneeling in fear, and rival families watching every movement. She didn't belong here. She never had. And yet she was beginning to care. About Margaret, about this house, about him, too much. And that frightened her more than any anonymous warning ever could. The next morning, she went to find Keenan. He was in his study, not working, just sitting there looking out the window. She wondered if he'd slept after what had happened with Margaret. Probably not. "I need to talk to you," she said. He turned toward her, not surprised, as if he'd been waiting for this. "I need to go home," Meredith said, keeping her voice steady. "I need to think. I need to breathe. I need not to be here for a while." Keenan didn't answer at once. He simply looked at her, and his face gave nothing away. This was what she hated most about him, when he became a wall and she couldn't read a single thought behind his eyes. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not respond at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, as if every word carried weight. "You'll come back, won't you?" Meredith held his gaze. "I'm not making promises." He nodded slowly. "You said you don't run." "I'm not running," she replied. "I just need not to be here for a little while. There's a difference." He didn't argue. He only watched her, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. Pain. Understanding. Acceptance. Maybe all of it at once. She drew in a breath. She hadn't planned to say the next part. She'd meant to keep it to herself. But standing there, in this room, looking at the man who had shown her the most vulnerable part of himself, she felt she owed him honesty. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "Not of your world, not of the threats or your enemies." She paused, swallowing. "I'm scared of what I'm feeling. I don't know what to do with it. I haven't felt this way in a very long time, and the last time I did, I got hurt, badly. So I need to leave. Not because of you, because of me. I need to understand what I'm doing before I go too far and can't find my way back." Keenan looked at her in silence. He didn't tell her she was being irrational, didn't say she was overthinking, didn't offer the empty reassurances men often reach for when a woman admits fear. He just nodded once, and somehow, that meant more than any speech could have. Meredith turned and walked out. She didn't look back. She was afraid that if she did, she'd change her mind. Jonas was waiting in the hallway, as if he'd known she would leave and had been prepared. He didn't question her decision, didn't ask why, didn't try to convince her to stay. He simply handed her a small card. "My number," he said. "If you need anything, anytime." Meredith looked down at the card in her hand, a simple piece of paper with a handwritten number. Nothing more. But she understood what it meant. This was Jonas's way of saying she had been accepted. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of this place now, whether she chose to return or not. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonas nodded once, then turned away, leaving her to go back to her room and pack. She didn't promise she would return, but she didn't say she wouldn't. And sometimes, that was enough. O'Hare Airport is always crowded and loud, no matter the hour. Meredith stood beneath the departure board, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling in her hand, watching the letters flicker and shift without truly seeing them. Her flight wouldn't leave for another 2 hours. She'd checked in. Her luggage was gone. Her documents had been scanned and approved. All that remained was waiting and thinking. She thought about every time she'd left in her life. The first was the orphanage, when she turned 18 and was pushed into the world with a duffel bag and a few $100s in state assistance. She didn't look back at the building that had raised her. She just walked away and never turned her head. Then her marriage. The night she finally found the courage to leave, she waited until her husband was drunk and asleep, stuffed a few clothes into a bag, and slipped out of the apartment at 3 a.m. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she had, she would have seen the bed where he hit her the first time, the wall he shoved her into while telling her he loved her. The 3 years of hell she endured because she believed it was all she deserved, so she didn't look back. She just left. It was the same with her old job, the same with short-lived relationships. Every time she walked away, she survived by refusing to turn around. That was her armor. If she didn't look back, she didn't have to face what she'd left behind. But standing in the airport now, she realized she wanted to look back. She wanted to think about Margaret and the soft curve of her smile on good days. About the rose garden and the tangled stories. About Keenan sitting beside his mother and crying without hiding it. About the night he read the letter and she held his hand in silence. She wanted to look back, and that frightened her more than anything else. She took a sip of coffee and winced. It was awful. Airport coffee always is. But she needed something to occupy her hands so her thoughts wouldn't run too far ahead. It didn't help. Meredith. She froze. She would know that voice anywhere. She turned. Keenan stood a few steps away, surrounded by the restless current of travelers moving through the terminal. No guards, no motorcade, nothing to announce him as the man Chicago feared. Just a man in a dark coat, his hair slightly out of place as if he'd rushed here. His eyes fixed on her with something she didn't dare name. "You said you wouldn't stop me," she said, and her voice wasn't as steady as she wanted it to be. "I'm not stopping you," Keenan replied. "I just need you to know one thing." He stepped closer, stopping an arm's length away, and held out an envelope. Meredith looked at it, then at him, then back at the envelope. She took it and opened it. Inside was a photograph. Margaret and Catherine standing together in the rose garden, both laughing. Summer sunlight, roses in full bloom. Two women who looked, in that moment, like the happiest people alive. Meredith turned the photo over. On the back was handwriting, Margaret's, unsteady but careful, as if written on one of her rare lucid days. "Thank you for sitting in the snow with me. Catherine would have liked you. My son is afraid of goodbyes. Be patient with him." Meredith read the words once, twice, a third time. Her eyes burned. She didn't know when Margaret had written it. Perhaps on her final clear day. Perhaps before. But somehow, she'd known. She'd known Meredith would leave, and she wanted her to understand that she saw it. "I'm not good at this," Keenan said, his voice rough. "I've been controlling everything since I was 12. Since my birth mother left. Since I decided that if I never let anyone get close, no one could leave me. I don't know how not to control." He paused, swallowing. "But I don't want you to go. That's it. Simple. Honest." He didn't ask her to stay. Didn't demand she change her mind. Didn't use money or power or any of the tools at his disposal. He just stood there in the middle of a crowded airport and told her the truth. He didn't want her to leave. Meredith looked at him, the man the city feared. The man who ran an empire with a voice devoid of emotion. The man who built walls against the world. He stood before her now with no weapon but honesty. No mask but truth. And that truth was enough to make her stop. Meredith looked at him, looked at the man who had followed her to the airport not to stop her, but to tell the truth. She looked into those eyes that had wept against his mother's shoulder, that had watched her in the dark while she spoke about her past, that had softened little by little with each day she stayed. "I know," she said. "That's it," Keenan asked. "I'm not making promises. I already told you. You also said you don't run." He held her to that. They stood there in the middle of the moving crowd, beneath the echo of flight announcements and the distant cry of a child somewhere down the terminal. The world continued around them, but in that moment, there were only two people. Meredith did something she hadn't expected herself to do. She stepped closer, rose onto her toes, and pressed a soft kiss against his cheek. Just a second. Light as a butterfly's wing, but enough to feel him go completely still. Still as if he feared that any movement would break the moment apart. "Make sure she eats breakfast," Meredith said as she stepped back. "She skips it." "I know," Keenan answered, his voice rough. "She told me this morning. She also said you cheat at chess." Meredith laughed, a real laugh, the first of the day. "I do not cheat. She's just that good." He didn't argue. He only looked at her with an expression she would carry through the flight, through the days that followed. Maybe for the rest of her life. She turned and walked toward her gate. She didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because some decisions require a single direction. And looking back isn't part of that direction. She needed to go. She needed to think. She needed to know whether what she felt was real, or just the illusion of a heart that had been lonely too long. So she left. On the plane, when Chicago became a scatter of lights beneath her, Meredith opened the envelope again. She studied the photograph, Margaret and Catherine smiling in the sun. She reread the trembling words on the back. "Thank you for sitting in the snow with me. My son is afraid of goodbyes. Be patient with him." And she cried. For the first time in this entire story, not silent tears in the dark where no one could see, not the quick brushing away of weakness. She cried openly, tears falling onto the photograph, her shoulders shaking. The passenger beside her glanced over in concern, but she didn't care. She wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying because she had dared to open her heart, something she believed she'd never do again after 3 years of bruises and broken promises. She had let someone see her scars. She had held someone's hand in the dark. She had cared, and she was still whole. Her phone vibrated, an unknown number, but she knew who it was. She ate eggs this morning. 2 of them. Complained about both. I think she liked them. Meredith laughed through her tears and typed back. Good. Take her to the garden in the morning. She likes the sunlight on the left side of the roses. I know. She said Catherine used to sing to the plants. She suggested I consider it. Meredith laughed out loud. The man beside her probably thought she was unwell, crying and laughing at once. She didn't care. Plants respond to sound. There are studies. Keenan Ashford doesn't sing to plants. Don't say I didn't warn you when they underperform. She waited. 3 small dots appeared. He was typing. Stopping. Typing again. Then the message came. Come back when you're ready. No pressure. No deadline. Just come back. Meredith stared at the words until the signal disappeared and the screen shifted to airplane mode. She looked out the window at clouds spread beneath her like an endless white sea. She would go home, back to her small apartment, back to her job, back to an ordinary life. She would breathe, and when she was ready, she would return. Not because he asked, not because Margaret needed her, but because she wanted to, because she was no longer afraid. Not of him, not of his world, not of being hurt. She had opened her heart. She had shown someone the ugliest parts of herself. And they hadn't run. They were still there. And she was still whole. Some people walk past. Some people stop. Meredith Callahan stopped. That night in the snow, when she had every reason to keep walking, she stopped for a stranger. And because she stopped, an old woman went home safely. A secret buried by the dead reached the person who needed it most. A son learned he had been loved not out of obligation, but by choice. And a man who had feared goodbyes since he was 12 stood in the middle of a crowded airport, with no weapon but the truth, and said the only honest thing left in him. He didn't want her to go. Sometimes a single moment of stopping can change an entire life. Not just yours, but the lives of people you may never have known. This story reminds us that kindness doesn't require a reason, that pausing to help a stranger can open doors we never imagined, that everyone carries scars, but scars don't define us, that love isn't determined by blood, but by choice, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts again after they've been broken. If this story touched your heart, you already know why. Please like and share so others can hear it too. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more heartfelt stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever stopped to help a stranger? Or has a stranger ever stopped for you when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments. We would truly love to hear what's in your heart. Wishing all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next story.